History is often taught as a series of battles, but before the first shot was fired at Pearl Harbor, a silent war was already starting. This war was being waged in the bank accounts and shipping lanes of the Pacific. In 1940, Japan was an empire on the move, but Japan was an empire built on borrowed energy. To understand why they attacked, we must look at Asia through the eyes of Tokyo. They called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, but to the rest of the world, it looked like a violent conquest of China. Japan needed steel, rubber, and above all, oil to fuel its massive war machine. But there was one problem. Japan had almost none of its own. 80% of their oil came from one place, the United States. Imagine trying to win a marathon while your opponent holds your water bottle. By 1941, the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to tighten the cap. Sanctions began to bite, moving from scrap metal to aviation fuel. The message from Washington was clear: get out of China, or we stop the flow. For the military hardliners in Tokyo, this was intense. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was a death sentence for their imperial dreams. They were being backed into a corner by a silent enemy. A cornered tiger is the most dangerous kind. The Japanese High Command met in smoke-filled rooms to discuss their very narrow set of options. They looked at their resource maps and saw red lines everywhere. The American embargo was a wall they couldn't simply climb over or ignore. The Navy and the Army argued over the next move. Should they strike north against the Soviets or south towards the rich oil fields? Every day they waited, their oil reserves dropped. The oil clock was now the most important piece of equipment in the entire Japanese empire. They needed a plan to neutralize the only force that could stop them from seizing the South: the United States Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. The stage was set for a gamble that would change the world. The gears of war were turning, fueled by the fear of running dry. By July 1941, the unthinkable happened. Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the US and established a total oil embargo. Suddenly, the Japanese empire had a literal expiration date. Their economy was hit by a cold front it couldn't survive. Their analysts sat in smoke-filled rooms, staring at charts that showed their national reserves dwindling day by day. They had enough oil for maybe 2 years of peace, or 1 year of war. The math was simple, and the math was terrifying. Every drop was now more precious than gold. They were literally shaking the barrels for any last scrap of fuel. The oil clock was ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Every hour, a Japanese ship patrolled the coast. Their future vanished. With every mile traveled, the empire was getting closer to a total standstill. This was a crisis of survival, not just strategy. The emperor's ministers faced a terrifying choice: cede to American demands, withdraw from China, and lose face and power, or seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies by force. To them, the South was a golden paradise that solved every problem. But there was a giant obstacle in the way: the US Pacific Fleet sitting right in the middle of the ocean at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii was the shield protecting the oil. As long as that fleet was active, any move south was a suicide mission. The Japanese army wanted to strike south immediately, fueled by their hunger for victory and resources. They were impatient, but the Navy knew better. They knew that as soon as they touched the Dutch or British colonies, the Americans would join the fight. If they were going to go to war, they had to make sure the US Navy couldn't fight back for at least 6 months. To win the South, they first had to win the Pacific. And to do that, they had to sink the giant while it slept. Enter Isoroku Yamamoto. He wasn't a hot-headed warmonger. He was perhaps the one man who truly understood the enemy.
Yamamoto had lived in America.
He had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C.
He saw the scale of American life.
From their massive diners to their endless rows of factories. He knew they were a giant. He saw the Detroit assembly lines and the steel mills of Pittsburgh. He knew exactly how massive the U.S. industrial furnace really was. While his colleagues in Tokyo dreamt of easy glory, Yamamoto was doing the math. And the math told him Japan couldn't win a long war. He famously warned, "If I am told to fight, I shall run wild for the first 6 months, but I have no confidence for the second or third years." He knew Japan's only hope was speed. They had to win before the American industrial giant could even get out of bed. Their only hope was a knockout blow, a punch so hard it would force the Americans to the negotiating table immediately. It was a strategy based on a psychological gamble. But his peers at the Imperial War Council thought he was absolutely insane. To reach Hawaii, the fleet would have to travel 3,500 miles across the North Pacific in total radio silence. It was a logistical nightmare. Total radio silence meant if anything went wrong, they were alone. No SOS, no reinforcements, just the cold ocean and the mission. They had to avoid every merchant ship along the way. If they were spotted, the surprise was over, and Japan's fate was sealed. Yamamoto was the ultimate gambler. He was betting the entire existence of his country on a single, daring roll of the dice. If he failed, there would be no second chance. If he succeeded, he might just buy Japan enough time to negotiate a peace. The plan was set. The ships were ready. Now they just had to do the impossible. Hit a target they couldn't see. The technical hurdles were staggering. Pearl Harbor was famously shallow, only about 45 feet deep. For a naval pilot, that was a nightmare. Standard aerial torpedoes would dive 70 feet or more before leveling out, meaning they'd just get stuck in the Hawaiian mud. To solve this, Japanese engineers had to rethink the torpedo itself. They needed something that could swim in a bathtub. They added wooden fins to the torpedoes to provide extra buoyancy and keep them level. A low-tech fix for a high-stakes problem. It worked. In the waters of Kagoshima Bay, their torpedoes now glided perfectly, just feet above the sea floor. The shallow harbor was no longer a shield. Who knew the secret to defeating the world's greatest navy was basically some fancy plywood? Strategy is weird. Meanwhile, pilots under Commander Fuchida trained relentlessly. They flew at dangerously low altitudes, sometimes just meters above the waves. Kagoshima Bay was their classroom because it perfectly mimicked the geography of Pearl Harbor. If they could fly it here, they could fly it there. They practiced surgical precision. In this war of resources, Japan couldn't afford to waste a single bomb. Every drop had to count. While Japan prepared in secret, Washington's codebreakers, Operation Magic, were listening. But they were drowning in a sea of data. They expected a strike, but in the wrong direction. All eyes were on the Philippines or Thailand. Hawaii was considered too safe. The American High Command believed the distance was their best defense. They thought Japan wouldn't dare strike so far from home. Fear of sabotage led General Short to bunch his planes together on the runways. He wanted to keep them easy to guard from the ground. It was great for preventing local theft, but for a bomber pilot, it was like being served a buffet on a silver platter. While the US slept, the Kido Butai was closing the gap. Preparation was about to meet complacency, and the world was about to explode. Diplomacy was the final thread holding the peace together. In late 1941, the world held its breath as messages flew back and forth. On November 26, 1941, the hull note arrived in Tokyo. It wasn't just a letter, it was a final, cold ultimatum.
U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull
Was the face of American resolve. He demanded a complete, unconditional withdrawal from China and Indochina. For the Japanese military, this was an impossible demand. Asking them to leave China was like asking them to erase 10 years of blood. Prime Minister Tojo read the note with growing fury. He viewed it as a plan to turn Japan into a third-rate power forever.
The diplomats were basically talking to a brick wall.
Every maybe was met with a giant, red, watercolor nope stamp. Diplomacy hadn't just failed, it had reached a dead end. The decision was made. The oil clock had finally struck midnight for Japan. That same day, far to the north, the order was given. Massive iron anchors were hauled from the freezing mud of the Kuril Islands. The Japanese strike force, led by Admiral Nagumo, weighed anchor and slipped into the foggy mists. 6 aircraft carriers began their deadly march. Admiral Nagumo was a master of carriers, but even he felt the weight of the moment. He was leading a ghost fleet into history. They chose the northern route to avoid detection. No merchant ships, no eyes, just the cold, grey storms of the North Pacific Ocean. This was the Kido Butai. 6 carriers, 2 battleships, and dozens of support ships vanished from the sight of the entire world. They sailed under strict radio silence. No messages out, no messages in. Even the heaters were turned off to save precious, dwindling fuel. They moved through the cold, stormy North Pacific. These were not the tropical waters of Hawaii, but a brutal, freezing grey nightmare. A ghost fleet carrying the fate of nations on its steel decks. They were heading toward a point of no return. As the Japanese fleet neared Hawaii, the mood at Pearl Harbor was disturbingly peaceful. It was a Sunday morning in paradise. It was December 7th, 1941. For many sailors, they were looking forward to a quiet Sunday of church, baseball, and relaxation. Ships were moored side by side in Battleship Row. It made them easier to refuel, but it also made them perfect, stationary targets. At the Opana radar station, 2 privates saw a massive cluster of dots. It was the largest signal they had ever seen. They were told not to worry about it. It's probably just some B-17s from California, their officer said. Famous last words. Back on the Japanese carriers, the air was electric. Pilots received their final briefings. The time for training was over. At dawn, the first wave of 183 planes roared down the decks. The carriers tilted into the wind to give the pilots every bit of lift. The sun rose over the Pacific, reflecting off the wings of Zeros, Vals, and Kates. A steel swarm was heading for Hawaii. Commander Fuchida looked down at the peaceful island of Oahu. He saw no blackouts, no anti-aircraft fire. The surprise was total. Below him, the Americans were still sleeping. The battleships were lined up, their crews unaware that the world was about to change. He tapped out the code. Tora, Tora, Tora! Tiger, Tiger, Tiger! It was the signal that total surprise had been achieved. The hunt had begun. The first bombers tilted their wings and plunged into the peaceful morning air of Hawaii. The time for diplomacy was over. The time for the knockout blow had finally arrived. The first bomb was released. The sound of the first explosion ripped through the Sunday morning stillness, waking the giant with a scream of fire. In an instant, the oil clock had stopped. A new clock had begun, one that would count the cost in blood and steel. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of fire and watercolor smoke. The harbor, once a sanctuary, had become a graveyard of steel. Despite the total surprise, the American response was incredibly brave. Sailors fought back with anything they could grab. Some sailors were so stunned they reached for their cameras instead of their guns. History doesn't just happen, it gets recorded. Then came the moment that would define the tragedy. The USS Arizona, the pride of the fleet, was about to meet its end. A single armor-piercing bomb found its way into the forward magazine. In an instant, the ship's own ammunition became its executioner. The resulting explosion was a roar that was heard for miles. The Arizona was gone in a heartbeat, taking over 1,000 men with her. The oil that Japan so desperately craved was now fueling a different kind of fire, burning on the very surface of the water. The USS Oklahoma capsized, turning its massive hull to the sky. By the end of the first wave, the Pacific Fleet was in ruins. But the Japanese weren't finished. The second wave of 170 planes was already arriving, diving through the thick pillars of smoke. A few American pilots managed to scramble into the air. They fought against impossible odds in a sky that belonged to the enemy. It was a desperate, high-stakes game of cat and mouse. Every Japanese plane shot down was a victory, but the harbor was still burning. Yamamoto had hit the battleships, but he had missed his most important targets. The U.S. aircraft carriers were not in port that day. Admiral Nagumo faced a choice: launch a third wave to destroy the fuel tanks and repair shops, or turn back now and save his ships. Nagumo chose caution. He left the fuel tanks untouched, the very lifeblood that would allow the U.S. Navy to rebuild so quickly. The Japanese fleet turned back. They had won the battle, but as the sun set, the first seeds of their ultimate defeat were already planted. News of the attack rippled across America like a tidal wave. In living rooms from New York to California, the world suddenly felt much smaller. President Roosevelt sat in the Oval Office, transforming his shock into a call for justice. He knew this was the point of no return. December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. With those words, Roosevelt unified a fractured nation with a single, burning purpose. Yamamoto's sleeping giant didn't just wake up. It reached for a giant industrial wrench. Japan had poked the wrong bear. Instead of breaking the American will, the attack acted as a catalyst. Millions of young men rushed to enlist, fueled by a rage for victory. Yamamoto's science of a bad decision was now becoming clear. He had achieved a tactical masterpiece, but a strategic catastrophe. The production clock had started. By 1943, the US was outproducing Japan 10-1. Japan's initial gamble was running out of time. Yamamoto allegedly remarked, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Japan seized the oil fields they wanted in the south, but they now faced a war of attrition they were destined to lose. The 6-month window Yamamoto had promised was closing. The tactical genius of Pearl Harbor would soon be overshadowed by the disaster at Midway. In the end, Pearl Harbor remains a masterclass in why a tactical win is meaningless if it leads to a strategic suicide. December 7th remains a reminder. Never mistake a temporary advantage for a permanent victory. The giant is awake, and history has been written. Because when you run out of time, and when you run out of oil, all that remains are the stories we tell, so we never make the same mistake again. And that is the science of a very, very bad decision. Class dismissed. Don't forget to check your fuel gauges. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the turning points of our world.